Not that hard. There we go. Okay, so now we are recording. And I will start by saying we have no class next week. It is February 17th. It's President's Day, and I very strongly believe if we have no school, we have no school, which includes us. So enjoy the day, take a nap, whatever it is that you need to do. We have also requested that apparently we put our pajamas on backwards and do a snow dance tonight. So you see all the teachers nodding right there. Um, my admin secretary like put it on our calendars for the whole office today. So I would just appreciate a snow dance that starts after noon because I have to run up to Girl Scout Council during lunch tomorrow. So it can snow anytime after I get to Girl Scout Council. Because if you're not busy enough, also have Girl Scout mom stuff to do. Shameless plug, if you need Girl Scout cookies, let me know. So I'm kind of trying to figure out where I'm going to start this week a little bit. And I'm doing that because I have a reading I often do for our classes. And I think I'm going to go ahead and start with this. So tonight, basically, the plan is we are going to do a little bit of student voice work in that I have stuff from students in the past. I know a lot of you guys have twice exceptional students now. You are parents of twice exceptional students. You might be twice exceptional yourself. And so, if you want to throw things in the chat or you want to share things, I've even had before, I've had some of my former students whose parents took the class hop on. So if you have a student who wants to share anything about their twice exceptional experience, they're always welcome to share their voices here about what the experience is like for them. But I'm going to start with an article I wrote. Gosh, I want to say it was 4 years ago now. Like you said, when the week has been 6 years long, it's hard to remember how long ago I wrote the article. But I was actually, I was lucky enough to win an award from the National Association for Gifted Children as a young leaders. Take young for what it's worth. It's 10 years since your last degree, not your actual age. But it made me feel good. And so I won this Young Leaders Award. And one of the things that they asked us to do was to write an article about our work, about why we did the work that we did. And so I decided to write about what it was like to grow up a twice exceptional person in a system that did not understand me. People have pointed out since then that some of the presentation that I have with this equates to trauma. And I can absolutely see that. So the title of my story was Coming Full Circle, My Journey from 2E Student to 2E Advocate. And I think one of the things I like about it the best is I am a product of Montgomery County Public Schools. So my journey in all of this really is also a journey of our school system. I think it's important sometimes to remember that while we had a twice exceptional program, which was called GTLD back in those days, many, many, many years ago, I didn't know about it. I had no access to it. And I don't know if they would have known what to do with me if I gotten there. So I'm just go ahead and read this, and then I'm going to bring in those other student voices as well. You are so smart, Sarah, my second grade teacher told me, but you can't learn because you have a problem. But the good news is there's a magic pill that can let you learn. You should talk to your parents. My problem? I had ADHD. I had ADHD in the mid-1980s when it became diagnosis du jour and everyone was taking Ritalin. My parents knew I was special. They had me tested. But they also decided that medication wasn't right for me. My teacher was mad that my parents wouldn't give me the magic pill, and I spent most of the rest of the year sitting in the hallway or the closet because I was a behavior problem. If you don't know me, I'm still a behavior problem. I just direct it now. There were never any discussions about other supports or resources that might be available. No one ever mentioned gifted with disabilities. And certainly no one ever thought that perhaps all the problems I was causing in the classroom was due to boredom because I had way too much time on my hands. I did, and it is. All of my behaviors were attributed to this disease that my parents wouldn't treat. In fact, by the end of third grade, my teachers refused to recommend me for the gifted program because of my behavior issues. Ironically, the at the school that actually had a GTLD program in 1987. One of the pieces, this is not in my article, but one of the pieces on the aside about why we don't do teacher recommendations for our CES programs anymore relates not personally to my story, but because of stories like this, where it was the teacher acting as a barrier because of their beliefs for gifted students to even be able to access the program. Without the support of most of our local school system, we navigated the next 10, 14 years as best we could. Looking back now, I can see how my access to assistive technology, scribe, mindfulness strategies, and strength-based learning practices helped me keep my head above water, but just barely. Most of these supports also came from my blessed and saintly mother, who at this point has been my primary support through K-12, undergrad, and 3 master's programs, maybe 4 master's programs now, and a career in education. Yes, there's a really good chance that some of the work I get done, even now, is because of my support system. And well, it was 2022, now it's 2025, and I can reflect on all that we in education have learned in the last 2 decades since my K-12 experience ended. Even in the last 5 years, our understanding of giftedness, disabilities, and of course the intersection of where those exceptionalities manifest in people who live with these complex brains. But what have we done for individual students? Although we've made great gains in research, it often feels we've made little progress on impacting the lives of actual twice exceptional students in public schools. We hear stories every day of students who can't get into gifted programs because of limited special education resources, or the child who can't receive an IEP because their cognitive scores are too high, or even on the occasion where the stars align and a gifted child can get an IEP, they struggle to receive services because how do I write a goal for a child who's already above grade level? I am fortunate to work in one of the few public school systems that offer direct services for 2E students as part of a continuum of services for both our special education and our accelerated enriched programs. On the special education side, we have direct program services for students in grades 3 through 12, where students who require specially designed instruction in order to access advanced courses can receive those services through a cohort model. Beyond these services, we also offer consultative services to special and general education teachers, which involves working with school teams to build their capacity in order to serve 2E students in their home schools. We also have these same services available to teachers and special educators in our schools with advanced learning programs, so that those who teach advanced learners on a daily basis know how to plan and program for these students. On the accelerated and enriched side of the curriculum, we highlight best practices for 2E and emergent multilingual learners as part of our standard professional development. Interestingly, my position as the 2E instructional specialist is actually housed in the curriculum office as a part of the accelerated and enriched instruction unit. Not only does this create a unique partnership between curriculum and special education, which allows us to deliver a wider range of services to 2E students who are both inside and outside of general education, but it also sends a powerful message across the system. Our message is that our students are gifted students who face a unique set of challenges, but they are still entitled to receive challenging curriculum that plays to their strengths while we teach strategies to mitigate or remediate their areas of weakness. As most people in central office will say, I miss the kids and I miss the direct impact I had on their lives on a daily basis. However, what I do know is that through my work, I am able to make a difference in the lives of thousands of 2E students, those who are identified and those who are struggling without understanding. I find joy in the growth I've seen in my central office colleagues who have expanded their understanding of 2E. These colleagues now stand with me as advocates for 2E students. We have special education specialists coaching special education teachers in how to support advanced curriculum. And we have AEI specialists coaching gifted classroom teachers on their role in supporting, adapting, and modifying for 2E students. I'm also inspired by feedback from classroom teachers where I'm out providing consults. It's rare that I have to explain that 2E is a thing. Generally, when I'm called for a consult, it's for specific supports or nuanced cases. Educators who complete our PD courses will say how important the learning is and how they can reflect on the number of 2E likely students they've had and how this learning has changed their thinking. More recently, we receive a number of requests for deeper learning, where educators are asking us to instruct them beyond the basics in serving, recognizing, and differentiating for 2E learners. They're asking us what's next. This is the major reason I do the work I do. Even though I know I won't see the faces of most of the students who benefit from the work we are doing, I know they're finding success because of it. Because of the work, we have more people at more levels in the system talking about 2E, 3E, and other special populations in gifted education, asking, what are we doing about this? And because of our work, we're no longer soulless in the cacophony of needs. Rather, we now have a large and growing choir of voices advocating for 2E students. But ultimately, I do the work for my 7-year-old self in second grade. Or for Sarah, the kindergartner, who was told by her teacher she didn't belong because 4-year-olds can't read. And then I got sent to the closet because I picked up a book and read it to her. I may have had my own chair in the principal's office. Uh, or third grade Sarah, or sixth grade Sarah, college freshman Sarah, who got kicked out of freshman bio lab and almost out of undergrad for my mouth. Oh, that was the second day of classes, by the way. Because while I love the work I do, and I love the students who grow because of that work, this is where I cry a little bit. I fight for that little girl who endured so much from an education system that didn't understand her. And I owe it to her to make sure that her suffering was not in vain. I did better than I usually do with that. I think it's important not only to share that, but to read that, and to be upset a little bit because our students still go through this all the time. And as much as I know that the work that many of us do, I know there's a lot of kids at home crying tonight because of something that happened at school today. I appreciate that. Kara said her principal said she wouldn't graduate high school. And I don't know what I would have done without my teacher, Larry March. Funny enough, if they had sent me to Fox Chapel back in the day, Larry would have been my teacher, and maybe I would not be this. On the other hand, maybe I wouldn't be fighting as hard as I do because I didn't have Larry. And if you haven't heard Larry March's name before, Larry was the original GTLD classroom teacher all those many, many years ago. And he was with us, I mean, he's still alive, he retired. But he was with us in the county until 2017 is when he retired. He came back briefly, and now he actually is the vice president for the Parent Network in Montgomery County, which is a grassroots group that helps support 2E families in Montgomery County. And really also that's how small the community is, and that's how long-ranging this community is as well. We are the oldest program in the country. We are the longest running program in the country. I hope we still continue. I don't know. I get questions about this all the time. I'm not being evasive. I actually don't know. I read the budget and I don't understand it. So what's going on? I don't know. But what I do know is that our kids are still here and they still need us. And I appreciate all of you for being here. And even when, I'm looking at who's joining us tonight, now you have CES teachers here. I have people from our magnet programs here. I have gen ed, I have special ed, just so many people who come to support our students because our students need all of our support because their needs are not single-sided. And I think one thing that I really try and bring to the forefront is that, if you are dyslexic, you're dyslexic, right? It's going to affect you every time you read. It's going to affect some of the things that you do. But it's not necessarily going to affect you on the basketball court or the playground. If you have a writing need, it's not necessarily going to affect you when you're talking to other people. But when you're twice exceptional, when you have all of these pieces that come together, and when you have a brain that is so different from gifted people, from typical people, and from people with disabilities, you end up in a much weirder environment, but you also are twice exceptional all the time. I am twice exceptional every morning when I have to remember to brush my teeth because typical people just know that's part of their morning routine. I have to think about my morning routine every single morning because it doesn't come naturally to me. I have habits where I move things around the bathroom because if it's in a place that looks different, that reminds me whether I have or haven't done part of my morning routine. I color code everything in my life. I color code the board that's in front of me. I color code my courses. One reason people have said, and this kind of goes back to having things not posted yet, The reason some of the stuff isn't posted is because I have to color code it. One, because I'm a little obsessive, but two, it's the only way I know when I taught the information that I taught. I know it all by color. It's a weird thing, but it is who I am. It's who I am when I talk to my friends. It's who I am when I go grocery shopping. It affects everything I do. Um, and that's an important thing to know, because when your students go home twice exceptional and when they come to school twice exceptional, they are themselves. Um, and as they're managing all of those pieces throughout their day, you guys get them fresh in the morning, their parents get them less fresh in the afternoon. And as the parent of a twice exceptional child, um, I'm really getting to see kind of that side now of what my mother got to deal with. And kind of seeing how it impacts us at home. And I laugh because one of my areas of disability is executive functioning, but I have the most solidly executive functioning brain in my household. And that's a scary thing some days. I will, in another presentation that we'll talk about later, one of the things I talk about is the fact that, like, everything in my kitchen is labeled. Not for me. I know where the spoons go. My husband doesn't, but he also doesn't read the labels to put the spoons where they belong. It's just one of those things. It's part of where his disability is. And when you have all of those different pieces coming together, it makes for a very interesting life. So with that, I'm actually going to pull some quotes that I have from students that I've kind of collected over the years. And I promise I'm going to show it to you as soon as I can figure out which button to press. Speaking of making a mess of things, my darling child had her online Hebrew class in here the other day. And so, as children with ADHD are wont to do, she played with everything on my desk and nothing's where it's supposed to be. So I am a little messy here. All right. So here's the beginning kind of our hearing to e-voices. So the premise of this started, some of these quotes are old. They've probably been collected over the course of 10 plus years. Some of them came in from before I was in this position. Some of them came in during online learning. And so I've kind of just tried to add to them over time. But the premise of the original question was, what do you wish your teachers knew about you as a learner? So when they talk about routines, one thing they said was one student said, I need clear and direct teaching and not hectic, frantic, or rush teaching and announcements of homework. Part of this discussion was really around the idea that when teachers, and I did it, I feel it, I know it, you're doing your thing, you don't get as far as you need to get into a lesson, and you're like, okay, you know what, guys, just go ahead and do it for homework. For kids who require routine and don't have that level of cognitive flexibility, they hear it, they don't necessarily remember it, it's not time to write down the homework, and it's not what they had planned for. So if we don't put that information out as soon as possible, they're going to really struggle. I prefer rubrics to long-winded explanations of projects. And I definitely talk about this in some of the other stuff that we do. And if you've ever done any ELC training with me, we definitely go over this. We actually introduced a thing in our classroom where we would pause and stop talking and allow the kids to read project descriptions and rubrics. And we might read it to them, but it was all concise and put out ahead of time so that they didn't have to kind of dig through lots and lots of words, but they could process it in a more concise format in front of them. Around seeing to their needs. I need teachers to be flexible with their teaching style when they teach someone like me. I think that kind of just speaks for itself. A lot of times teachers think they're being flexible, but then they run into a twice exceptional kid who is very different, and they have a lot of trouble flexing what they do best to meet the needs of the student. I find it problematic when discussions are one-sided or do not clarify confusing points of information. Again, I think this speaks a lot to some of the rigidity of our students. Sometimes we think we're clarifying things, and our students ask questions that they can even feel a little inane sometimes, but truly for them, they're trying to dissect and parse out what it is that we are expecting of them, what we're asking them to do. Some of the planning ahead piece. It's hard to copy notes and listen to an explanation of them at the same time. Um, Funny enough, I can't see everybody on here, but there's somebody in the meeting or in this right now. I was in a meeting with this last week, and the parent actually said that to us. And I was like, I know, I understand. And see, I do understand. It was on my slide. I did not make this after that meeting. Um, it's really funny also if you've ever been in an IEP meeting with me. I will take notes until you expect me to talk, and then I stop taking notes because I cannot take notes and talk at the same time. And at the same time, I can sit there and take dictation. I can type everything that was said in the meeting. If you ask me what was said, I have no idea. But I've written down absolutely everything everybody has said. Um, it's just part of how some people's brains work. And then, when the expectation is that our students have taken notes, it doesn't work for all of them. So sometimes giving them notes ahead of time and letting them doodle on them, fill in the blank, draw pictures. I used to draw these, I had these two little characters that would tell jokes about the content. And that was the only way you knew I was paying attention, is if my little owl characters were making snide remarks about what my teacher was talking about. Because if I made a snide remark about it, it was because I actually heard what you said, processed it, and came up with a response. And I just wasn't calling them out loud. It was also a coping strategy. Visual learner who can't learn with just slides with words. And, I think we've gotten better about this over time. Um, and yes, ironically, I do understand that my slides are all just words right now. Um, but there are some kids that just the words on the slide and you talking at them is just too much. And then we also have having explanations in multiple places. And that's a lot of what this is, having multiple ways to communicate ideas to our students. Everyone tells me how smart I am, but I just can't get my grades to reflect it. Kind of the point of my whole story as well. This was not my quote. Um, but our kids hear that and they internalize it and they repeat it back. And if you hear those things enough time, what you come to believe is that your grades can never get better. So you might as well just do as you please because it's not going to matter. So kind of helping them maybe even reframe, grades aren't everything. Yes, they're important in a lot of contexts, but they're not everything. And helping them find ways to show their own growth is important. I wish my teacher could understand I'm really intelligent, but a slow reader. And we see that, I think, with a lot of our students. We talk about, we'll talk a little bit about this later also, but there's this idea that smart is like Jeopardy. And Jeopardy, you ask the question, you ring in, you get the answer really quickly. And so we almost get this perception, not almost, we get this perception that speed is related to intelligence, and it's not. Um, that is one way to show intelligence, that quick recall, that ability to make some of those fast connections and to pull information from places. But some people, whether it's reading or thinking, they need the time to recall that depth of thought. They need the time to hear your question, make some connections of their own, and then put their answer out there. It's one of those reasons why wait time becomes really important, not just for students with disabilities, but also students with high abilities, because sometimes there's so much information in there, they have to wade through it. And if they have trouble with the executive functioning pieces and being able to pull some of that together, what comes out is no answers, slow answers, and that tends to look like struggle when really it's not. It's just a different way to show their intelligence. So I know that this is the first one about grammar and spelling is a hard one. And as an English teacher, I feel it. I think this is also one of those opportunities to slide in some of the work around AI. Um, I've been doing a lot of work with it because I figure it's coming whether I like it or not. So I might as well make it my friend instead of my enemy. Um, and I think spelling and grammar check are some of those great ways to kind of introduce that idea. Spelling and grammar does matter very, very much, but knowing how to spell everything perfectly, knowing where your commas always go, is not necessarily the best use of twice exceptional kids' time, or really most kids' time. Learning to get a feel for language so that they know when to check and when to use some of these tools to help them is a much more effective use of time. And when we're grading our students, unless we're specifically teaching a grammar lesson and grading a grammar lesson, when we're trying to see if they know content, giving them some of that leeway around their writing to show that to demonstrate that they show what their knowledge. There's a definite balance set. I never mean extremes when I give examples, because there are times to grade grammar, there are times to make it important, but it's kind of one of those, it's a little bit pick your battles, and it's a little bit focus on what's most important. Because what is simple for a typical student might be, unending for a student who's twice exceptional. And if we throw in pieces of perfectionism and parts like that with these profiles, their willingness to engage is going to go down very quickly, because if they know they can't make it perfect, they're not going to start, or they're going to keep going and never submit because it's not good enough. And we don't want to set those more fatalistic parameters for them. We want to help them focus on whatever is the most important thing at the time. Um, I hope people don't still say that using accommodations is cheating. I have literally heard teachers say that before, and it's not. And unless you have questions, I'm not even going to talk about that one much more. So one of the really interesting pieces in here is this idea of the repetitive work. One thing that's important to know with gifted brains is that a typical person requires, I believe it's 7 to 10 or 8 to 10 repetitions in order to learn something. A gifted person requires 1 to 3 repetitions. So when we talk about practice work and some of the ways that our instruction is set up, it's set up for a typical student because that's what's typical. That's what most students need. But for our students, when they say they're bored, when they feel that it's being repetitive, it is, it's meant to be repetitive, and we lose their attention quickly. I fell into this all the time. I would get bored because I already understood what you were trying to get me to say. You wanted me to do it 19 other times. I wasn't going to. So one, I was being insubordinate, and two, I would then find something else to do with my time. And it was never productive. And that's really our area for kids getting in trouble. So kind of thinking about different ways that they can show knowledge, demonstrate interest or growth in a topic without having to do the same practice over and over and over again in order to solidify that understanding. We will talk about extended time and deadlines at another time. I'm not going to belabor that piece right now. I know this one is hard. Teachers taking advantage of the good stuff online. I know we're in a really tight spot right now where people want us to follow canned curriculum in a very exacting kind of way, which is often not good for our twice exceptional students for both sides of their needs. But it's still worth considering what's out there, what's available, especially when we have other times during the day where we can be flexible, or when we have opportunities for some of our times around growth. Those are always opportunities that we might have for using creative things. The other thing is there's a lot of creative mind mapping software and other like visual organizational things. So ways for students to take notes or to outline their thinking before they go into writing is something that should be available to students online. I'm going to skip this part about the prerequisite. That was mostly about online learning and class and blocking modules on Canvas. This one really hits me, and it hits me because a lot of students, there's a thing about auditory processing disorder, and then there's a piece with lots and lots of students who have ADHD also have auditory processing disorder or something akin to that, where they're hearing the words that are coming out of your mouth and they are not registering, and they are looking at you and they are paying attention. And in my brain, it's like I see the words floating by and I'm trying to grab them and they just slide right through my fingers. And then you ask me, what do you think of that? And I go, I have no idea because I don't know what you were talking about. And as an adult, I can say that. I can absolutely say, I know for sure you were just talking and I have no clue what you told me. But what kid can do that? And then in the classroom, you stand up, you give directions, you do X, Y, Z, and they turn around and they say, okay, well, what's your first step? What are you doing? And the kid looks at them and goes, I don't know, because they don't know. And they were listening to you, but they weren't able to grasp onto those pieces and hold them down. And so helping students, especially if they do that repetitively, finding ways that they can connect, touch base, that you can break up what you're saying into smaller chunks so that they can figure out those next steps. And this is where, and I had a teacher say this recently, I chunk everything I do. And I said, I absolutely believe that you do, but your chunks are still too big for some of our students. I almost think of it like, if you think about if you've ever done baby-led weaning, where you don't make all the stuff mashed, but you let the kids eat the regular food when they show interest in it. When I did this, I did not hand my 8-month-old large bites of steak. Even though I broke down the steak for myself, I still cut up very small bits for her to chew on and practice chewing on. It's the same idea. You've chunked that steak. You're not handing them a cow, but they still might need you to cut it up, and they might need you to cut it in smaller pieces. And it's not that it's to support what their needs are and where they're at in their growth. And I am gonna stop that share for a minute. Why? Because that's actually the last part of that slide from that presentation. No, I see that, Erin. She said, the quote I jumped over that said, that was my son. He really didn't want to go back. I very much remember that. I will say Erin's son is one of my favorite students. I have a wonderful time every time I go see him. And he very much did not want to come back in the classroom. And that really was true of a lot of twice exceptional students. And for a variety of reasons. For some of them, it was just being able to control their environment, being able to move without feeling embarrassed, being able to lie on the floor and listen. I know for me, it was just cutting out the drive to work every morning gave me so much more time to focus. I was better able to ground myself every day before I got to work. It's one of the reasons that I like teaching this class online. I love teaching this class in person, but frankly, I can't get a good rhythm in teaching and doing these things as well as I can when I'm doing this from home, where I've come home, I've started my routine, my kid is off doing her thing, I come upstairs and I can go right back downstairs and be involved with her again after class. Whereas if I was in person, I'd be driving here, driving there. It just, the rhythm isn't right. And it was a hard thing to come back. And I can't imagine, and that was with me having a lot of my own agency. For our students, they basically had no agency. They were informed they were going back. And it was a very hard transition for them. And that's true with a lot of transitions in general, whether we're shifting topics, shifting classes. Clutch, that was the word I was trying to think of last week when I said in my brain, I visualize sometimes having a gear shift, but sometimes it's like the clutch is sticky and like I have trouble shifting those gears. And so for our kids who feel like they have no agency in a lot of things, that was a huge piece for them being told like they had to go back and there were no other options. Just checking my notes real quick. I'm gonna actually just ask also right now, because I do see a couple of people have their kiddos with them, or you've put things into chat. If anybody wanted to share any experience they have with student voice with their own voice, if you put in chat, I'm happy to read it. If you want to come off and just chat a little bit about your own experience as a teacher of twice exceptional people or being a twice exceptional person, I really do invite you to speak.
Hi.
I can share something. My older brother is I would consider him a twice exceptional learner. However, he did not finish high school, and I really feel as if it was because teachers couldn't understand him. I knew I wanted to be a teacher since I was 4. That's been my passion, my calling. But growing up, my brother was that type of student that needed to like bang their pencil on the desk, needed to like he would play like he would sit on the carpet and like, play a beat on his shoes. He just needed to move around. And a lot of the teachers like didn't really understand that. So he started to feel really like he shut down. He's very smart, like with science, like you can tell him anything, and he would like tell you. He's very smart, but I didn't feel as if teachers understood that he just needed to move around or he needed something to hold. And that's the reason why I try to like really understand my students and get to know them. And yeah, so I'm excited to take this class because I feel like I'm already learning a lot and how I can help others.
And I wish I was better at the statistics on this. I used to know them much better, but gifted kids are one of the most likely groups to drop out of high school. And twice exceptional kids are either slightly ahead or not far behind in those statistics. Um, and it has to do with their disillusionment of learning and the disillusionment of how they feel about learning and how they feel about educators feeling about them. You know, all that movement, whether it's because his brain was busy or his body needed to be busy. And without guessing folks' ages, you know, things have changed a lot in the last 20, 30 years, but um, that expectation of, you know, sit down, fold your hands, face forward, is detrimental to some of our kids. And for kids who need to move to learn, um, why would you stay? Especially when you have the opportunity to learn and be interested in things outside of school. And school is a constant battle of just hiding who you are, hiding what you know, not being interested in anything, and then being told to even go against what your own body is doing. And that is not to say that we should also be necessarily, you know, getting up and running laps around the classroom, although um, you know, some of that instruction becomes teaching students how to use that. So he likes to drum, right? Drumming is annoying if it's not you doing it. I love to drum, but I cannot stand other people drumming. But can we help people channel what those pieces they're doing? My sister-in-law and I were talking the other day about pen clicking, because pen clicking is one of those things. And she said, I love to click pens and I hate it when other people click pens. And we said, well, the funny thing is mechanical pencils are actually pretty quiet, especially if you take the lead out, and you can click them all day long and they don't make a sound, but you still get that feeling in your hand when you're clicking them. So it's not necessarily about saying carte blanche, do as you please, but it also is not about shaming people for some of these pieces that they need to do, and that they need to participate. So somebody shared, my son is an SES, and I've often felt that he's GTLD, struggles with behavior, emotions, diagnosed with I get this wrong, DMDD, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, ADHD, anxiety. I'm sorry, I just saw some of that. Very, very smart, very good at things. Um, so interestingly, I went through a very similar thing. And the relationship between some of these pieces, especially DMDD, ADHD, and what's the other one? Oppositional defiant disorder. I knew I could come up with it. These are all conditions that are very much related, especially not ADHD, I'll put ADHD for a side, but the disruptive mood piece and the oppositional defiant disorder are both disorders that are very reliant on how other people perceive behavior. And one of the potential um, choices in podcast that you can listen to is actually one that talks about oppositional defiant disorder and kind of why it can be a problematic diagnosis. Um, my daughter actually has that diagnosis, and it's one that I'm not particularly comfortable with, because while I see why she meets the criteria, I don't doubt that. My issue is actually with the criteria itself, which is how she reacts to other people in certain settings. And so it's really hard to say somebody has a disorder because of how they react to you. It's not how she acts, it's not how she is in all settings, it's how they are in certain settings. So, you know, some of these diagnoses that are out there, they can be really difficult to understand. They can be difficult to especially when we're also talking about gifted children, because a lot of the behaviors that we see are also indicative of giftedness. And so it is sometimes very hard to kind of dig out, when are we seeing behavior because of behavior? When are we seeing it because of a disability? And then when kid who can't keep themselves together during the day. One of the things that we will talk about, um, sorry, I'm having a moment where I decide I have the asynchronous slides up on here, but I also have the equity slides up. I'm kind of tossing back and forth in my head which way I want to go right now. Because we can talk about, I think all of them are super important. But I will say one of the things with asynchronicity is gifted children's brains develop at very different rates. And the more developed some of your intelligence and some of these other areas are, the less developed your social skills and some of those other pieces are. Because if you think about a brain, some people have, you know, they have that growth going out kind of everywhere. And some people have it going really hard in one direction and not so hard in another direction. And when we see asynchronicity, that asynchronous gap, whatever it is, remains that gap, usually up until about between the ages of like 25 and 30. So when we have a student who, you know, is intellectually in their 20s, but age-wise they're 7 and behavior-wise they're 4, when you kind of do that math, when they're, I can't do that math, but I'm going to try really hard for a minute. So let's fast forward 10 years. We now have a 17-year-old child who has the intellectual abilities of a 30-year-old, but they have the social abilities of a 14-year-old. And at 17, they're a senior in high school. They might even be like I was going into college. That's a huge gap, you know, and that evening out doesn't happen until, and if we use my ages for as an example, I didn't really even out till I was about 28. So another 10 years past graduating from high school before these pieces started to even out for me. That's a lot to deal with. And then when you think about some of these actions and behaviors and, you know, you've got the ability to come back with sassy responses, but you don't necessarily have the social skills to know you shouldn't, that creates a lot of animosity for our students to deal with. I feel like I may have gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but I also kind of, you know, hope that that pulls that together. And I will redirect a little bit also, so you can unmute if you need to. Yes, respecting one's differences is very critical. And, you know, everybody has preferences for learning, but I know at some point they were very much like you're either auditory or you're visual or you're kinesthetic. Ultimately, everybody's a little bit of everything, but you have preferences. I can learn in certain ways. I just don't like to. I am a person who likes movement. If you don't notice my hands, I try to keep them under the camera so I don't annoy people, but I gesticulate a lot. And when I was growing up, I found that I struggled with writing papers. Mostly what I did is I had to learn how to read shorthand because my mother took shorthand and I would circle and pace and pace and pace the kitchen, the living room, whatever I could pace. Daddy would go upstairs. He could not handle this. And I would talk and my mom would take dictation. She'd take shorthand of everything I said. And then she was like, okay, now you get to go type it. It's also how I learned how to type quickly because I can stand and type. I couldn't necessarily stand and write. It's, you know, but I couldn't do that in school. So I wouldn't get any work done during the school day. So, you know, when we learn about some of these preferences or access to technology, these are all things that we need to be aware of because they really do have purposes for all of our students. I think I want to jump into the equity stuff. And I want to talk about it for specifically because I know I just petered out in my brain there for a minute. I want to talk about it because I know a lot of the examples that I use, especially so far, have been myself, and as a white female, that's not necessarily the norm. And so I want to make sure we shine light on other areas around choice exceptionality and kind of what those pieces are. And also hopefully that refocuses me because clearly I need a little bit of focus tonight. So what I'm going to do, because we will take our break at 8 o'clock, is I'm going to kind of set the stage for our next section, where we are going to be talking about what does equity look like in terms of twice exceptionality and in terms of giftedness. So I do want to run through some definitions first. And yes, when I get my magical Canvas screen back together, all of this will be posted. So specifically, and I will talk about the report. I want to talk about this particular section, this report that came out in 2015-16 that was called System Failure, Access Denied. And it was an in-depth look into gifted education in the US, specifically about identification of minority students or traditionally minoritized students and access to gifted education. There are important caveats in this, not the least of which that the report is now 10 years old. That doesn't take away from what they found at all, but there are things that have changed somewhat in the last 10 years. So you guys will have access to this whole piece. I used to actually have people read it, but frankly, it's a little bit overwhelming. So we're going to go through it instead, and then if this becomes an area of interest for you, I highly encourage you to go back and read it more in depth. So the first one we're going to talk about are the laws, and there's a lot of numbers on here, but essentially what we're looking at is what states have laws about gifted education, what states have laws about identification, and then who funds. So not surprising, Maryland does not fund. Are you shocked? It's okay. You can be shocked. Maryland does not fund gifted education at all, but we do have laws considering both programming and identification for students. When this report came out in 2015, we changed our laws. We went over COMAR last week. We changed our laws in 2019. So obviously this is not completely reflective of what it is. But essentially, if we look overall, most states say something. 38 states say something about gifted ed. Only 7 states have required identification language. 30 states talk about requiring identification and services. But of those 30 states, 6 are not funded. 4 are fully funded, and the 13 states have no laws, with 11 having some language, 4 having some funding, and there are 2 states that have no language mandate or funding. I used to remember which those were. I can't right now. I feel like actually California is one of them, which seems weird, but California doesn't talk about gifted ed, so I'm pretty sure they're one of them. I'd have to go back and look. But yeah, Maryland is one of those states that has language for identification and services and no funding. So when we talk about access, access is specifically looking at this, the ability to attend a school that identifies students with gifts and talents. So specifically, we were looking at students having access to gifted and talented programs. And that becomes one of those things where in Montgomery County, we don't have any programs that are identified as gifted and talented. We have our Centers for Enriched Studies, we have magnet programs, but because gifted identification is not tied to being in any of those programs, technically that would not count as access, which is weird. But it, you know, for consistency purposes, it's important to know that part. So the equity idea, the equity numbers come from Donna Ford, and she basically took the way numbers work with the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission and applied it to education. And so this was where they were figuring out how do we talk about different populations within education and whether or not they are equitably represented in terms of access and instruction. And then the missingness piece are the students who should be found, but they aren't. So there's a lot that went into what these pieces are, but basically, again, using some of those ideas from the EEOC, how do we find students who are not being identified because they either have no access to identification or no access to programming, or based on the number of students they have within the population, they are not being given access to programming. I'm going to skip over some of the local norming stuff because we might talk about that later. So one of the pieces that's going to be up, I promise, I really do promise this week, I'm going to put up the playlist on the role of gifted programming and pieces about how equity and gifted programming work, because what they have found is in systems where they had access to gifted programming and that access was taken away, usually in the name of being equitable, what they find overall is that students who are in traditionally minoritized populations end up having less access overall, less growth academically, and less acceptance into college. There's a definite downward trend, because what they find is, like most things, public education becomes that great kind of equalizer in some ways. I'm being a little pie in the sky here for sure. But when you have gifted opportunities and enriched opportunities within the school system, everybody generally in theory has access to those opportunities. Whereas when they go away, those who are wealthy enough to afford those experiences can provide them for their children, whether that's private school or whether that's after school programs. And students whose parents cannot afford or don't have access to give them access to those programs don't have that access. And so the gap between generally the haves and the have-nots tends to widen. And that's what a lot of these are researchers and experts talking about that. So I also want to talk about special populations versus underrepresented populations, and really underrepresented should really be more, I prefer the term traditionally minoritized, because even as we say here, underrepresented populations are underrepresented due to outside forces, not because they don't deserve to be recognized or deserve to be represented. And it becomes those social factors that really play the big part. So the full definition of this of a special population would be small or rare part. So some of the examples are here: ethnically diverse backgrounds, LGBTQ+, twice exceptional, highly profoundly gifted, those experiencing gender issues, low socioeconomic status, or those impacted by geographic issues such as being in urban areas or rural areas. These are all special populations. Special populations are not necessarily underrepresented populations. So underrepresented populations are ones that are underrepresented due to those outside barriers, social barriers. They require different methods of identification in order to appropriately access or appropriately identify. A lot of that is because a lot of the things that we use to identify giftedness have cultural bias to them, and so therefore they are inherently biased about pulling students from different groups. And these students in the underrepresented populations are the ones who are most likely to be identified in that missingness column. These are the students who are unlikely to have the access that they need. And these tend to be our students from cultural linguistic background, those impacted by poverty, and our rural populations are actually some of the highest numbers of underrepresented populations. What you don't see on here would be our choice exceptional students, highly profoundly gifted, those experiencing gender impact around the LGBTQA+. I'm going to use the word spectrum. And we will talk about those as special populations as we go through. So I think, well, I'll keep going on a couple of these things. So this is a chart that kind of shows what we talked about earlier. Maryland falls in this little red box here where we have laws for identification and services, but we have no funding. So I guess we're in good company. I don't know. At least we have something. And then this is the Maryland report card from this report. You can see when it talks about access to gifted education identification specifically, we were rated D, and it says that 69.46% of students that identify students with gifts and talents. We ranked 27 out of 50, including the 50 states and DC. Now, interesting point in here, and it kind of falls in the same thing with equity between the Title I and non-Title I schools. What's interesting is when you break down the numbers within the state of Maryland, Montgomery County doesn't come out the worst. It isn't actually quite as bad as this. What becomes really interesting when you look at it is that Maryland is so diverse as a state that we have, you know, if you think all the way out to the corners, you've got Washington County, Garrett County, Cecil County, where they have Title I schools that are very predominantly white or white Latino and have very few African American students. And so, but then you compare also when you have like Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Montgomery County, PG County. When you take us as a state, we kind of balance each other out, but we also don't balance each other out. So when we look at something like Prince George's County, they actually really should be closer to an A in terms of Title I school students that are identified and have access to things. Whereas other places in the state, I know I was reading, I was supporting a process for one of our counties, and I asked why they didn't delineate out their identification of African American students. And it's because they're a county of about 3,000 kids and they have like 14 African American students. Percentage wise, we can't do a whole lot with that without revealing the specific identifying information of who those students are. So there is a little bit of understanding that needs to go with this report card. But it still is kind of interesting overall when you think about all the things we do have access to and how all the things we do have access to and all the discrepancies within here. I'm going to say we also have kind of that similar issue when you look at the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. Again, it's really hard to kind of pull information on that when we don't have a lot of students in that population. And I think as an example, at one point when I was teaching, 100% of the Native American students at our school at Northwood were identified as gifted. But then he graduated and then we're down to 0. So we have to take some of these numbers for what they are. So before we into the whole triple identity theory piece, I'm going to have us take our break. So we'll be back here in, let's say, 10 minutes. And yeah, I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to pause the recording.
So, you know, there are questions that I have now because I want to take this very seriously. And again, after the COVID, with the cheating online, using this, especially for language class.
I think it's a great question. That's actually why I turned the recording back on also. And it's not a clear, like everything in Twice Exceptional Land, there's no clear-cut answer. And so one thing I will say without trying to get myself too off task, because clearly I can go off on anything at any point in time. One of the things I was just talking to my Twice Exceptional case managers about, we had our quarterly-esque semesterly training last week. And one thing we were talking about was the need to incorporate best practice AI instruction as part of our Twice Exceptional curriculum, specifically for what you're talking about. Our kids will, sometimes they don't even consider it cheating. Like they have part of their ability, usually for any Twice Exceptional kid, one of their great abilities is to logic their way through anything, whether or not logic applies. It could be magical thinking. It could just be their innate ability to argue anything their way. That's not an official Twice Exceptional trait, but it's a Twice Exceptional trait. And so, so I think part of that question is, yes, we want them to have access when access makes sense and it helps them express their learning. At the same time, there's a balance for sure because our kids will find every way they're not supposed to use it. I can't ever have a flip side of a coin. It's a flip side of oh my God, I just lost the word for it. It's the flip side of dice or something. Like, because another flip side of this is teaching them responsibility and teaching them to make good decisions about things is sometimes more important than the lesson we're teaching them in terms of content. Um, we, I mean, I remember when I first started teaching Twice Exceptional High School, it was the year after the big cheating scandal up at Churchill, where a whole bunch of kids hacked the grade books. And I came in to my students and I was like, they were chatting about it. And I said, look, I'm not telling you what is or isn't right. What I'm telling you is don't do it when the timestamp says you were supposed to be with me because I need my job. And they were like, that seems fair. And a lot of them have gone into computers and things since then. Um, but it was that idea of like, I'm not trying to like go down that path of, you know, you must do this, you must do that, because I wasn't going to win that because they would argue their way through it. But to say, hey, you have the responsibility to make a good decision. And in this case, I'm asking you to care about me. It was facetious for sure. Obviously, I didn't want them hacking the grade books, but it was that kind of levity approach that when them go, I could choose to make a better choice. And sometimes that is the way to go about it with the students is we could do this, or we could make a slightly better choice and do something else. I mean, as far as grouping them together, I think it depends a little bit on what their needs are, and whether you think in the end or whether they can show that you'll get a better product. I think sometimes you also have to know that whatever you ask them to do, they will probably take to the nth degree. They will borderline inappropriate as much as they can. They will skirt around every rule they possibly can. But if they're giving you a really good product and at the end it's something that follows the rubric and it's what you wanted, sometimes that free reign is good. Not to use another example, but I mean, I remember at one point we had a whole thing about persuasive writing, like all the different types of writing that we were supposed to be doing. And for my project, I decided to create my own religion. And then I decided to practice that religion. And the theory behind my religion was that if I incorporated enough different religions into my religion, I would never have to go to school because every day would be a religious holiday. I mean, I probably shouldn't skip as much school as I did, but ultimately I wrote the paper and I learned a lot about a lot of different religions. And eventually I had to go back to school. Was it 100% what everybody wanted? No, but I mean, I got there eventually. Um, that's what I mean with it, like that balance piece of what do the kids need? What do you need from them? Part of especially in learning another language, a lot of our students actually really struggle with that. And what I find very interesting, either they become crazy fluent. One of my Twice Exceptional kids is fluent in Spanish, English, Hebrew. She's passing French. She's also fluent in American Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language, and can do a little bit of Arabic. That's her. At the same time, I had other students in there who, they're like, I know English is my first language, but it's not really my best language. That's also fair. So, when you're thinking about what it is that they're doing and what they need access to, technology might not be the best thing if they're terrible spellers and they're learning, French. Maybe just doing as much oral as you possibly can. Can they record their answers? Are there pieces of those technologies that they can use in order to become better French students that don't tax what their disabilities already might be? So those are, I think, some things to think about. Kara mentioned that back in 2000, Larry had them create a website in their free time when they were done with the lesson and their expert projects. We actually still do those expert projects. We do them in middle school now. And we've also added into a piece of that. A lot of our students now are working on this whole thing about becoming, what am I thinking about? Oh, they're doing an analysis of their IEP where they're creating their own IEP presentation about what is my disability, where am I, where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses? And they actually go through all the parts of the IEP, including an analysis of their goals and how they think they may or may not have made progress on goals. So, we do still do some of those
Larry
things.
had us go through our IEP and make snapshots for ourselves. because when we would go into gen ed classes, we would like, here's our snapshot to our teachers,
Yep.
which I used in middle school, high school, undergrad, grad, and I even handed to my principal. I was like, these are the things I need. And she's like,
I love it.
oh, I'm like, thank you.
I absolutely love it. And yeah, I actually used to have my seniors chair their last meeting. Because I'm like, look, you're going to college. I'm not going with you. Sometimes it felt like I went with them. Because they would still call for help or advice or whatever, but I would sit there. I'd make them sit with me sometimes and write parts of the IEP, and then I would make them chair. No, legally I chaired, but they would chair their own meetings and they would take us through. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. This is what I need. So it's all part of that ownership and diving into where their strengths are and what their needs are. So I'm going to hop back onto our equity piece. And I left off with the triple identity theory because this is going to lead into some other things. I actually finally met Dr. Bonner in person at the conference this last year. And I was such a fangirl. It was so embarrassing. I was like, oh my gosh, Dr. Bonner, I read all your research papers. And he's like, that's so exciting. Nobody reads my research papers. It was a moment. And so I talked to him about what we do with some of his work. And it was super exciting. I'm really, really hoping I can get him to come speak to class. I try and bring in guest speakers, and I will give you a preview of who's coming in our next couple of classes. Still playing email tag, so I'm hoping Dr. Bonner will be able to come and speak to us. But what I really like with Dr. Bonner's work, and it really gives us a difference between, okay, we're going to go through this. But one thing Dr. Bonner said in his research is males who are often Black, even advanced and gifted Black males, are often treated as if they have a disabling condition simply by being Black. Said differently, racism and ethnic bias towards gifted Black boys can exhibit a similar impact as autism and ADHD experienced among their white male counterparts. So he actually puts forth a theory of, especially for Black males, Blackness being its own type of disability. And I acknowledge that because what we want to talk about is these three different labels. I think it's important to give voice to them. I also know that it can be very sticky in the brain sometimes when we kind of talk through what these pieces are. But at a glance, we talk about twice exceptional. And twice exceptional also has been traditionally, we've been GTLD. There's a movement towards multi-exceptionality. I will tell you now, I don't use multi-exceptionality specifically because the acronym ME is going to be very hard to do Google searches on. 2E still gets us to what we want to find. So I do acknowledge that twice exceptional really is about multiple exceptionalities, but I'm still calling it 2E. Then we have this idea of twice exceptional with a Y, which is what Dr. Bonner put forth. And that idea that these are children who are not disabled, but because of who they are, it mimics a disability in terms of statistics and identification. And then we have this idea of thrice exceptional. And thrice exceptional, or 3E, are our students who are gifted. They do have a disability, and they are also part of one of those minoritized groups, usually racial, ethnic minorities or language minorities. Thrice exceptional does not go into some of those other underrepresented populations, specifically the low SES or rural or urban, as part of that thriceness. So here's kind of a side-by-side of what we have for our twice exceptional students. And then we go into the idea of that thrice exceptionality. Joy Lawson Davis is amazing. She's one of my favorite people. She writes extensively on thrice exceptionality and is one of the people who coined the term. And we have an article, but I also will have a link for you guys to check out that is a podcast, if you would prefer not to read an article, where she's talking about this idea of being 3E. Sean Anthony Robinson is a He's a doctor of education, and he talks a lot about the impact. He is a student who is also thrice exceptional. He's an adult now. He was a student who was thrice exceptional, and he specifically has dyslexia. And he talks about the fact that he didn't learn to read till after he graduated high school. And it is notable that he graduated high school not being able to read. It took him, I believe he said 12 years to get his PhD, but he got his PhD. Um, and he talks about this experience. And so he and Dr. Davis come together and have worked through creating this definition, this theory, and really a whole body of research that is super important when it comes to our equity discussions. So you will have a playlist, and I'm going to show it to you actually right now. Oh, good, it actually shows. Get very excited when things work. Can you guys still see that? You should be seeing the Google Doc, I hope. Awesome. So like I said, we have our neurodiversity podcast where she's talking about what is 3E. We also have the article from Educators' Perceptions of Twice Exceptional African American Males. I was looking for, oh, Colin Seal is another good one. I got to hang out a little bit with Colin Seal this last conference as well. He's super exciting. He can make a really good point, and what he's a lot of theoretical. There's not a lot of practical with what he talks about, but I appreciate the theoretical pieces that he brings and some of the ideas that he brings that could potentially become realities. We have more articles potentially to read, and some of these also, as you get down here, like Inspiring Next African American Scientists, these are going to be a little bit more accessible. These are from Teaching for High Potential. So these are written by researchers and educators for educators. And then there's also this last piece, which is the state-by-state data tool. It is older. And one thing that is a little bit interesting, I sometimes use that term in interesting ways. But one thing that's I think really interesting is that part of the change that happened back in 2019 was supposed to lead to more data reporting to the state. And then that whole, what was it? Oh yeah, pandemic happened, which impacted our ability to identify, it impacted our ability to really get information. And as a result, there was not a lot of data collection that happened. So there's a lot of lagging numbers for Maryland. Again, just kind of a caveat, heads up, if you go in there to look at any of those pieces. So I want to move into our gifted EMLs, both students with and without learning differences. And one of the reasons I group them together, honestly, is because there's not a lot of research, which is really, really frustrating because this is one of our largest growing populations of students. And of course, you know, some of the struggle is that because so much of our testing, so much of our data collection is done based on your knowledge of the English language, it can be really hard to tell. Does a student have a language deficit because of a disability, or is it a language deficit because of exposure? Like I will tell you, I have a deficit in French. I can speak maybe 5 words. I've also taken 0 French classes. I'm pretty proud that I can speak 5 words. You know, but when we have our students coming in and have needs and they have that limited English experience, there's a lot of digging, and one thing we don't tend to dig on very much is whether or not they are gifted and how we identify that giftedness without using their knowledge of the English language. Because again, if giftedness is how your brain functions, your brain doesn't function necessarily in English unless that was your language that you were taught. And so you still have the same needs when it comes to, you know, combating boredom, social needs, the repetition piece. You don't need things necessarily repeated as many times. So when you go into the playlist around EMLs, there is like that mix of gifted and twice exceptional because the body of research is not what it should be. I have worked for a while to try and get us a speaker who specializes in this area. So if you go back and look at any of my previous classes and my previous guests, I don't have anyone speaking on EMLs. I am desperately working on it. And the thing is, I know people, they just never seem to be available on Monday nights. Maybe I just need friends who are available on Mondays. So this talks a little bit about different ways that we can go through and identify our students. It is something we're working on in MCPS. I'm really glad that we did bring back COGAT because there are the quantitative and nonverbal sections which don't require knowledge of English language in order to show understanding. And I'm hoping that that will have a turn in what we are able to do for our students who are gifted EMLs. So students who are in the LGBTQ plus community, it's really an interesting population. And it's an interesting population because they are actually almost overrepresented. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Usually when we talk about overrepresentation, it's because of access, especially when we're talking about in terms of race. Interestingly, in the LGBTQ community, one of the things they think might be a reason for this this difference is because people who are growing up LGBTQ plus, I'm trying to get it all right in there, they have to manage differently in a heteronormative world. They have to sometimes do some mental gymnastics and other pieces. They have to learn more introspectively about themselves because it's not part of the normative culture. And because of that, it develops some of their creative thinking at an earlier age. It develops critical thinking skills at an earlier age. And so there is, while it's not solid research, I don't think that's quite the right word for it because it hasn't been studied in that research way. There is a lot of writing within the field about kind of the why behind, giftedness. Like we've said before, it's 10 to 12%, depending on what numbers you're playing with of a general population. In the LGBTQ plus community, it tends to run, I think it's closer to 50%. The other thing that's very interesting when we talk about some of our gender identities, so I have a slide for that. I do. Yeah, so there's different gender considerations piece. Let me go back actually, so I don't over distract myself. So one of the interesting things is when we look at gifted populations in terms of male and female and trans, whether you are identifying as non-binary or a different gender than you were at birth, that tends to be significantly higher when we talk about giftedness. It's also a smaller population, so it's a harder population to research. And of course, when you're in a culture where you can't necessarily say that's how you feel, it is a little bit harder for identification. When we look at numbers in MCPS, about 50% of our gifted population, or rather, when we look at our students who are gifted, we're pretty even 50-50 for boys and girls, or males and females. When we look at our population as a whole, we're again about the same, our 12 to 15% male, 12 to 15% female. For our students who identify as non-binary, we're at like 76% identified as gifted. Gender is not part of our consideration when we're looking at giftedness, but it's interesting to pull the data and to see those numbers. Again, it's a very small population. And then another piece of that really is, when we talk about the gender makeup of our different classrooms, I try to be very, open to say, yes, frequently our classrooms especially our twice exceptional program classrooms are heavy white male. Interestingly, I've stopped saying that about my high schools because the students there have such fluidity in their gender identification that it's easier not to identify at all. And then that is partially their preference. You will excuse for one moment. Good night, dear. 8-year-olds need a hug goodnight. So it is an area that's of interest. And there is actually, I think I've linked it on that playlist. There is a speaker, Teresa Manzella, who spoke to us about 2 years ago as the parent of a student in the community, and what their experience was like. So if that is an area of interest, I really recommend that you go back and see Teresa's presentation. So one of the gender consideration pieces we also have is the fact that girls are so underdiagnosed with specifically autism, also ADHD. That is starting to even out just a little bit. But because girls tend to be more the inattentive, it's harder often, and they don't tend to act out as much. It's harder to identify. And those are just some of those pieces of gender considerations for both the disability and the giftedness. The other thing we also want to talk about is the difference between giftedness and achievement. And I alluded to this earlier. I said we were going to come back to it because giftedness really talks about how your brain works, how you have strong cognitive abilities in different areas, and you know, gifted brains tend to have more, where they like the curls in them, the wrinkles in them. They tend to make connections earlier and hold them longer. They also tend to prune connections off their brains at a faster rate than their non-gifted peers, which is why it's so important to really exercise their brains when they are young, because they are losing those abilities at a faster rate than their typical peers. This is different than achievement. Achievement is doing good at school, doing well at school. Being able to take advanced coursework, being able to participate in class. All of those things are about achievement. And that is different than our giftedness. And I do have a slide that we can go through as we get through here. So when we talk about our giftedness and poverty, we know that our Black, Hispanic, and Native American students are the majority of our students who are living in impoverished circumstances or have low SES opportunity. I'm losing my words here. They're also part of that group that's least likely to be identified as gifted. Again, so much of this is about access and early access and not about ability or potential. And so when we have students who are not having opportunities to show their giftedness or to learn some of those non-traditional things like critical thinking, creative thinking at a young age, it's harder for them to have that opportunity to identify. We also know from Dr. Bonner's work that these students are more likely to be seen as acting up as opposed to being gifted. And those are things that those are just they're factors out there. It's part of the reason that we do local norming in MCPS. And I did say we were going to come back to that. Local norming is when we norm students based on a locality as opposed to at the national level. And in MCPS, I'm going to try and explain it. We essentially break down into 5 bands. We look at schools that are low impact, low impact farms, medium, mid-range, high, medium, high impact, and high impact. That's 5, right? Yeah, that's 5. So when we norm our student groups, we norm schools that are impacted by farms rates at a high level against other high level farm schools and not against our low impact farm schools. So for example, my daughter goes to a Title I school. Her school is going to be normed against not schools over in Potomac. That's just sort of how we set up. At the same time, just because you're a Title I school does not actually mean that you're as impacted as other Title I schools. So that is not one of the measures that we use. And we do that specifically so that we have like students with like experiences being normed against each other as opposed to being normed against students who have had more opportunities. That is a crash course in local norming. There's a lot of research out there if you want to read more in depth. The other thing on the other end, that's mostly especially talking about elementary, But the other piece that we really hit is that piece where it talks about teenagers in poverty having to balance advanced coursework with having to work. I saw this a lot myself when I was teaching at Northwood, where I had students who were absolutely brilliant and they couldn't take more than 1 or 2 AP classes because their families needed them to have a job after school. And there's a lot of privilege to being able to stay at home and do homework for 5 and 6 and 7 AP classes. We have been trying to level the playing field some. According to Blueprint, now each county is supposed to have to pay for everybody's AP and IB classes, or tests rather, but that has not always been the norm, and that is the barrier because those tests all cost money. So we have students who have the privilege of financial security, food security, who are able to take these classes. They're able not only to qualify for classes through MC, which are covered by MCPS. I don't think families are paying for those classes. I could be wrong. I get that wrong sometimes. But then you also have to afford the ability to get yourself to class or have computer access if you're going to take an online class. So there's still, even with choice, a lot of privilege that comes into play that is a barrier for our gifted students to show their giftedness. And so that, again, kind of in turn impacts. And then when we add in disability on top of that, one thing I find that is very frustrating to me is the number of families who have to engage advocates or attorneys in order to get their choice exceptionality recognized. Is there a requirement? No. Does it happen all the time? No. But there's definitely privilege at play if you can afford to have somebody come in who has experience argue your points. And there's also, I'm not gonna say it's prevalent, but there is something to the fact that teams will sometimes see an advocate's coming and take their word at face value. And that becomes a privilege. Whether or not their word is accurate is not the question. The question is, it's somebody else at the table saying, this is what this student needs, and are able to say it in a way that makes sense to the team, where that privilege is not extended to another student because their family doesn't have that ability. So there are important things to keep in mind, especially when we are seeking to identify students and identify what their needs are, and remembering that when we look at what supports are, accommodations, IEPs, any of these things, it's about that educational access. It's about more than just their grades and whether or not they're getting good grades right now, but it's really looking holistically at the student and seeing all of their needs, both gifted and disability. So real quick, yeah, we'll talk through these. Some of the things that we do to try and change these outcomes. One of them is the universal screening. I am still shocked by the number of places in the country that don't do universal screening. And what universal screening is when we say every single second grader is going to be screened for GT. There are some caveats to that. We talked about it before. You know, we have some special schools that are not in that. Students who have been identified for alternative learning outcomes are not put through that, specifically because, I mean, we've heard both sides, but families say, you know, if you've gone through Appendix A to determine that your child is not diploma bound, do you really want to get a letter from the county saying, by the way, your kid is also not gifted? Thanks. So, you know, parents whose students are on alternative learning outcomes can request that their students be screened for giftedness, but they are not automatically in that pool. Otherwise, all second graders are screened for giftedness. We screen multiple times because, as we've asked before, well, if we have a kid who's just come into the country, you know, and speaks zero English, is it fair to screen them? Well, 2 of the 3 batteries are nonverbal, so yes, it could be, but we also do multiple universal screenings. We do them in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade, and 7th grade right now. And so that is one of those avenues that we have to try and catch kids as they develop, because students also develop at different rates, and you might not hit your stride until 5th grade or 7th grade. So we do have multiple opportunities. We do not do the domain-specific performance indicators. We are looking at that. I'm drawing up some stuff right now because it's of interest to me. And what that means is right now it's more of a universal giftedness. Are you hitting here, 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 here? What domain specific is you might be identified as gifted in verbal linguistics. You might be identified in quantitative mathematics. Some districts do that, some states do that. One of our questions with it is, does that overexpand us? And then do we need to start identifying giftedness in the arts, giftedness in leadership? Those are all domains of of potential giftedness. It's a lot. So more for your knowledge than anything else. Local norming we just talked about. And then the challenging curriculum piece, it's the idea that, and that this is a little bit where our magnet programs are coming from at this point. And also that having things like ELC, having the advanced math courses, having the humanities options. The idea of this is that we put the kids in the advanced courses and then we screen them afterwards, after they've had that exposure. One thing we also do is we have primary talent development coaches in all of our Title I schools. We have part of their job is to teach some of these critical thinking skills that students might not otherwise get and expose them to these opportunities to learn. And that's something that it comes from our Title I money that is in all of our Title I schools. And then a piece of this also becomes, like I said, unless you've gone through Appendix A for determining a student being on alternative learning outcomes, all of our students with IEPs are also screened. And there is not that same barrier of, I'm not recommending you. Another thing that we do to support this is school psychologists, GT liaisons, we try and put this in their training. If you do an individual assessment for a student, you're sitting at a meeting and you talk about a WISC score or any of those, there is an avenue for school teams to submit that direct paperwork to my office, and we can identify students as gifted with that paperwork. So even though they tend to not do as well on some of these group tests that we have, like with MAPR, with COGAT, they tend to do better in one-on-one settings. And so we have the avenue to take that information and share that with our office and identify our students as gifted directly. We're not clicking. That must make you the last slide on this one. So the comment on here is we had a kid who qualified for 4-5 math and the school team decided not to have him in it due to the IEP and not being able to have an additional support person. Don't tell me what school you are. I will tell you that is flat out illegal. It is a violation of their rights as a student with an IEP. It is a violation of Office of Civil Rights, and they have told us that very directly. We had a case a couple of years ago. It's easier to talk about now. Our student is graduating in college. The student was recommended to go to a special education program, but that student also got accepted to one of our high school magnets. And the team said, we cannot meet the IEP, we cannot meet the student's social emotional needs at this magnet program because they need to be in this self-contained setting. Parents ended up taking it to the Office of Office of Civil Rights, OCR, and OCR came back and said it was a criteria-based program. It was not a lottery-based, it wasn't an interest-based, it was a criteria-based, and he met the criteria, and therefore we were required to make it accessible to him. So, yeah, some of those are reasons that you guys reach out to me for sure. And there are occasions where we've also had that, and I think there's another team here where we had a student and we did everything we could within the magnet program to try and meet that student's needs, and the needs were beyond. But the difference also was that student was no longer able to access the curriculum despite all the supports we provided, whereas this high school student was able to access the curriculum. Might not have made the social skills progress we would have liked him to make in 4 years, but he was able to access the program. And so that kind of becomes some of the questions that we have to ask when we're looking at this is, again, what is our goal? What are we reaching for? If the program is detrimental to the student, there's a different conversation, then it's too hard for the grown-ups to provide the support the student needs. And that's work I end up doing frequently with our school teams. See, we have about 10 minutes left, which never a good idea for me to start something with 10 minutes left. So I think what I want to do is, one, I want to let you guys know about some sessions we have coming up. So first of all, next week is February 17th. It is President's Day. Time cards are due. But as I've said before, I don't believe in making you guys rush home after a day of no school to have school. So there will be no class on the 17th. On the 24th, February 24th, I'm very excited. Dr. Matt Fugate, who I read you some of Matt's school. We actually watched a little snippet of Matt, of that Western Kentucky University clip. So Matt's actually going to come and talk to us. I probably should read the text message and figure out what it is we said we were going to talk about. But I think we are planning to talk about Twice Exceptional as its own culture. It's a really interesting conversation. Matt specializes in a couple different areas. ADHD is one of the areas he focuses on. ADHD in girls and giftedness in girls is another area of focus for him. I will put it up. I promise I'll put it up. But Matt has a podcast that he did on the Neurodiversity podcast where he talks about the attention divergent hypergiftedness and how it's a new way to look at ADHD. And so I will get that up because I highly encourage you to see that before or listen to that before Matt comes to join us. And then on March 3rd, we have the other Dr. Matt. Dr. Matt Zakreski is joining us. I'm super excited. Matt actually just published a book earlier this year. Oh, wait, it's February, so that would be later last year, called the Neurodiversity Handbook. I'm in the middle of reading it, so I'm still haven't put out stuff to recommend specifically about what we can read from there. But what I really appreciate, and that is also a twice, not surprising, most of the people in Twice Exceptional are also Twice Exceptional. But I've been to a couple things with Matt, and he is going to be talking about some of the more about the social emotional needs of our Twice Exceptional kiddos. And his whole book is really geared towards mostly teenagers, I would say, and adults on kind of how to navigate the world through, like, I'm going to say it's how to deal with normal people. Like, we are Twice Exceptional, we are neurodivergent, and he helps us kind of figure out how do you deal with the normal people out there. And then March 24th, we have Dr. Claire Hughes. And so Dr. Claire Hughes is the current president of CEC TAG. And she, we read that definition of Twice Exceptional that was put out by CEC in 2022. Claire was the head of the committee that ran that, and she runs the Twice Exceptional, what is it called? She runs the Twice Exceptional Teachers master's degree out of Cleveland State University. And so Claire's going to come talk to us mostly about a book that she's been working on that really is meant to be a handbook for teachers to teach Twice Exceptional children. And it talks about how we blend the best of gifted practice and special education practice into a true Twice Exceptional practice. So those are some of the things coming up. So like I promised, you do not have to listen to me talk 2 hours a week every week. And you get a whole break from me next week. One thing I'll say before I send you guys off is that on our Canvas page, one of the few things that's actually up there right now, is a link. So if you do want to meet with me, click that link and you can schedule a 30-minute meeting with me during the day. I can answer questions about class. If you have some other questions, happy to do that. Also, if you shoot me an email, in my signature line is a link for you to click to set an appointment with me. Emailing me and asking me for a meeting is the worst thing to do because it will get lost in my email. I will mean to answer it. I won't answer it. Click the link because then it shows up in my calendar. When I sit down in the morning and go, where do I have to be today? It's already on my calendar and I know that's where I have to be. If you're emailing as a staff person, there's a link. If you're emailing as a parent, there's a link. So just try and click on the right link so I'm in the right mindset to talk to you. Otherwise, I'm going to let us go a little bit early tonight. Not a lot early, but a little early. And I'm going to stop the recording now to answer any non-recording questions that people might have.